I first have to look at, my question was, why would we need to change? Why would we need to change things? And we've seen that we have invented a lot, we've been very productive, but in the last 50 years with modern project management, things seem to have slowed down for some reason. So what's happening? Well, Eddie made a point this morning that complexity, and also Darren, complexity and turbulence are increasing. And if you look at complexity is linked to ambiguity. Ambiguity is when you have a choice between multiple options. So you may have all the information you need, you may have a high degree of certainty, but you have multiple choices. That creates ambiguity. Now, when we talk about uncertainty, you may or may not have many choices, but you don't know how you're going to actually implement it. There is a degree of unknown in the actual execution of what you're doing. Okay? So there are two distinct ideas. And I wanted to point that out because I'm going to talk about ambiguity and uncertainty and how, as project managers, we are very competent to deal with uncertainty. And we have a lot of experts here who do, for example, risk management. And risk management is about managing uncertainty. Uncertainty, my friend David Hilson is there, so I have to say, uncertainty that matters. Okay. But are we good at dealing with ambiguity? Project managers, as a rule, we like to have our path well traced. We like to have a good plan and then follow the plan. Not follow blindly. I mean, obviously making decisions along the way, but having a good hold on what's happening. Ambiguity, on the other hand, when you have to make multiple choices, decisions, it's complex. You never know where you're going to end up. You're always on one foot or the other. So how do we deal with that? And if we look at the situation as what happened in the different years, before the 20th century, ambiguity was not very high. You had just a few choices. It wasn't complicated. And things were happening over time. They weren't changing too often. Things were kind of going on, and you had time to think. Now, in the 20th century, things started moving a bit further. You had more decisions to make more often. The decisions were a bit more complex. There were more things involved. Before that, people were not traveling very far. When the British Empire existed, you traveled far, but you have time. It took 2 months or 3 months to go to India and to Australia, and you had time to reflect and think. Today, we fly to Australia in 20 hours, and very soon we might fly even quicker when Richard Branson has put in his moon space thing. We could be in Australia in a few hours. And with the Concorde, you were flying over the Atlantic in 2.5 hours. With the internet, with the social media, Eddie showed us this morning a way to communicate, have meetings remotely, virtually. So things are instantaneous, and boundaries are disappearing very fast. So today, when we're talking of the 21st century, what happens is that we have something like this. Time is shortened, and ambiguity goes up and down like that all the time. Now, I don't know if some of you know, but typically in a project, uncertainty is high at the beginning and low at the end. I sat in a conference a few years back where one of the speakers said, at the beginning of a project, you know nothing, okay? But you can do everything. At the end of the project, you know everything, but you can't do anything anymore. So that, I think, was a good definition of uncertainty. Now, ambiguity, as you notice, is not going down like that. It's going up and down. Why? Because you resolve a problem, you make a choice, make a decision, and then the situation changes because it's complex, and ambiguity rises again, and you have to make another decision. Good examples of that are agile management, for example, where people meet every day to resolve the problems that have happened over the day because things are changing so fast. So basically, the idea is that ambiguity goes up and down. You can never fully resolve ambiguity. What you resolve it until the next problem or next output occurs. So, how does it affect the organization? I usually put pictures, you saw the picture of Gaddis earlier, I usually put pictures of people who have quotes like that because I like people to say, oh, they look really old, they have gray hair, they must be very wise, you know. These two don't fit the picture. I'm not sure why I put them there, but they are very good. They have written a number of scholarly papers which are quite interesting. And more specifically, they've looked at how organizations deal with complexity and turbulence. They're from Harvard. And they say that rapid technological change, deregulation, and globalization have intensified competition and increased the turbulence. Because of that, there is more turbulence. Things are changing faster and quicker that managers face, forcing them to adopt more responsive organizational forms. So what do they have to do? They have to respond more quickly to different situations that were unexpected. Okay. The degree of interdependence among the decisions that a firm faces is a key driver to complexity. So complexity is not about complicated things. It's not because you have many pieces in a puzzle that is complex. A puzzle is complicated. Okay? It has many pieces. The complexity is about the interaction between different actors, different possible decisions, and things like that. That's what creates complexity and ambiguity. Another speaker at a conference like that gave another example which was quite good. He said an airplane motor, and I think we have at least one person from Rolls-Royce here, is complicated. You may have 100,000 pieces or thousands of pieces in it, but if you have a plan of the motor and you put someone to it and you assemble it and unassemble it a few times, you will know how to build it. So that's complicated. It's not complex. He said complexity, the example of complexity, is a plate of spaghetti, where you just have spaghetti and oil. Put a fork in it, turn it, and you never know what you have at the end. That's complex. Complexity is about the unknown unknowns. When we talk about uncertainty, we talk about known unknowns, things that you could find out if you look hard enough. Here we're talking about unknown unknowns. There's no way to predict. But as Eddie was saying this morning, there are ways to see patterns. Okay? So, what they say, these people, they say organizations have to be more responsive. Now, most of us work in these big organizations which are not very responsive. So, what happens really in organizations? If we take the complexity and the turbulence and put them on a matrix, what we could say is that, the low uncertainty here, low turbulence, low uncertainty is typically ongoing actions. It's day-to-day management, business as usual, things like that. Whereas when you're talking about high uncertainty, you're talking about change actions. Anything that involves change. Okay. On the other hand, if we look at ambiguity, you could say that a low ambiguity is about execution. You don't have a lot of interacting decisions. You have decisions to make, but they're quite clear-cut. You have a decision to make between should I use stainless steel, for example, or should I use aluminum. You have a decision to make on which technology you should use for your new computer system. These are relatively simple decisions, okay, that you can make rationally. When we're talking about high ambiguity, we're really talking about interacting decisions, strategic decisions. How is the market going to be in 2 years? How should we react to this new technology? How should we react to the fact that a new competitor came on the market and things like that? These are much more complex. Okay. If we look at how organizations behave in these areas, we are, in fact, in organizations moving from a low complexity, low ambiguity, which is the more traditional modern organization approach, to a higher ambiguity and higher uncertainty. So here, organizations typically focused on continuity. And if you look, for example, at the example of the big shipyards, if you look at the example of the auto industry in the US and even in the UK, they were focusing on continuity. They thought that it would be like that forever. Now, if you look at organizations today, how they have to focus on quick response, be more responsive to the environment, be able to react more quickly. And basically, if you're in the high ambiguity, low uncertainty area, you can focus on analysis. It's making decisions that are difficult, but because there's low uncertainty, you have time. Low turbulence and low uncertainty, you have time. You have the time to look at different options, examine them, gather the necessary data to make the right decision. Okay? So you can focus on rational analysis. And here, high uncertainty, low ambiguity, we focus on results. We know where we're going. We know how to get there. We just have to get there as best as we can. And typically, this is the area where projects are. The modern project management approach is in that area. Now, we're going to see how potentially we can look at the bigger picture. Now, I'm going to give you two examples. I told you I was going to tell you how Pfizer and Nintendo worked on that. And what happened, Pfizer was a company that was focusing on continuity, even if they were in drug development and innovation. But what happened, they were looking at the development of a heart disease drug. And Pfizer had this process that before throwing away a product on which they had spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of resources, they would first see, is there anything else we can do with it? And during that meeting, I wasn't there at the meeting, but during that meeting, I've heard that one of the researchers lifted their hand and said, and this is the urban myth, obviously, it has an interesting side effect that maybe we could use. And from that, they developed Viagra, which, as some of you may know, made Pfizer one of the top pharmaceutical industries in the world. Now, another example is the Nintendo Wii. The Nintendo Wii. What happened, Nintendo was the first company in gaming for a long time, but they had these arcades games. And when games became on personal computer and consoles, Nintendo came up with the Nintendo Cube, and it was quite successful. And then both Sony and Microsoft said, oh, this looks like an interesting market. Maybe we should pour millions in there and try to take control, which they did with the PlayStation and the Xbox. And Nintendo was slowly losing its market. They had been number one there for a long time, but because they didn't have the money to compete with these big players who were in all kinds of other fields, they basically needed to do something new. And in fact, instead of focusing on continuity, continuing to produce a better Cube, a better Nintendo Cube, the version 3 and 4, etc., they went completely to something different. And they developed the Wii with this little stick. And it completely changed the market of gaming. Because now everybody could play. I mean, I remember when I was doing my MSc, my kids had a PlayStation at the time, and there was a game we really liked. And when I had finished working in the evening, it was maybe, midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. And I felt really stressed. And before going to bed, I went down and practiced on the PlayStation, and I became very good at one of the games. And at one point, my daughter, who was at the time 13-year-old, caught me downstairs and said, Dad, you're cheating. You're practicing while we sleep. You send us to bed, and then you go play the PlayStation. But anyway, it does take time. And most of us who are working don't have time. That's why teenagers are so good at these games, and we are not. I mean, sorry. Many of you are probably still teenagers, and you are good at these games, but I'm not. And I'm not ready to take the time. But what the Wii did, it made it very easy. I played Wii with one of my friend's daughter the other day. We played tennis, and I could play because it's like the tennis game. And we played ping pong, and we played golf and all that. And I could play, and I was so happy with myself, you know. And it put the gaming back into the whole family. And it changed the whole idea of gamers being potato couches. Now you have Wii exercise and things like that. And people do classes with Wii. Exercise classes and Pilates and things like that with Wii. And it completely changed the market. And now it's Sony and Xbox and Microsoft trying to catch up. So they did something completely different. They responded to a market that was there and that they knew was untapped. The market of the whole family instead of just the young teenage boy, usually gamer.